the clerk will report.
Calendar number 231 S3436, a bill to require the imposition of sanctions with respect to entities responsible for the planning, construction, or operation of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and so forth and further purposes.
Madam President.
The senator from New Hampshire.
Madam President, I come to the floor today to speak in opposition to Senate Bill 3436, which is the Nord Stream 2 sanctions bill sponsored by Senator Cruz. I certainly share the concerns that have been expressed just a few minutes ago by Senator McConnell about the threat that Russia poses to Ukraine and to Eastern Europe, and the role that Nord Stream 2 plays in that critical issue. I have been a strong and long-standing opponent of Nord Stream 2. I believe now what I believed at the time that I originally co-sponsored the Nord Stream 2 sanctions bill with Senator Cruz, that the Nord Stream 2 pipeline is a long-term threat to the energy security of Europe. But right now we're in a different place on this. And while Senator Cruz and I worked together on sanctions legislation to stop this pipeline, my disagreement now with Senator Cruz is in his approach to what we need to do to address what is right now a much more serious threat to Europe, to NATO, to the transatlantic alliance, and that is Russia's threat against Ukraine. And what Senator Cruz's bill would do is not stop Nord Stream 2. It would undermine the current diplomatic situation that is absolutely critical if we are going to respond to the Russian threat. His bill is a vote. Supporting his bill would be a vote to compromise transatlantic unity. It is a vote that breaks the message of bipartisan support in the face of Russian aggression, and furthermore, not just bipartisan support, but allied support with the United States and Germany and Western Europe against the threat that Russia poses to Ukraine and really to Eastern Germany if they take this action. The dynamics on Nord Stream 2 have changed since Senator Cruz and I fought for the passage of legislation to prevent the completion of that pipeline. At the time, we worked together to provide the Trump administration with critical tools to sanction this pipeline, and we did that because there were some members of the Trump administration who came to us and said, we need this legislation because the administration has not acted. And the fact is 95% of the construction of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline was completed during the Trump years. Unfortunately, the Trump administration they waited until literally the last day of the Trump administration to sanction just one entity in 4 years. And so what we saw is what I just said, that 95% of that pipeline was completed during the Trump years. Now, we are in a very different situation right now, unfortunately, because we are in a situation where Russia is threatening Ukraine, and we need to work closely with our European allies to present a united front against Russia. We have strengthened our relationship with our German allies. The Biden administration has restored a diplomacy-first foreign policy, which seeks to advance American policy interests through dialogue and not through threats. And there is a new German coalition government in place that we are now engaging with. It's a government that has appears to be more skeptical about the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. They have paused certification of the pipeline and stalled its operation until at least later this year. And the new government has indicated that this pipeline is not just an economic project. So it's very clear that the dynamics have changed. And when the dynamics change on the ground, then our approach and our foreign policy should reflect those changes. We can't look at this legislation in isolation. This legislation that Senator Cruz is proposing, that we're going to be voting on today, is coming at a time when the administration is exhausting every single diplomatic avenue to deter Putin from further violating Ukraine's territorial integrity. Russia has amassed over 100,000 troops on Ukraine's border, and of course the next month or so are really going to be critical in changing Putin's calculation that any invasion would come with a hefty price. And Nord Stream 2 right now presents a potential incentive for Putin to use against our European partners. But it's also leverage. It's leverage that the West can use at a pivotal moment as Russia's thinking about, Vladimir Putin is thinking about what he's going to do in Ukraine. So I believe we need to stop this pipeline long term. And there may be a time in the future when another change in our approach on the pipeline may be necessary. As we know, that happens with foreign policy. We don't live in a static world. It's dynamic, and it demands that we adapt our responses. I have joined Senator Menendez and 38 Democrats in introducing the Defending Ukraine Sovereignty Act of 2022, legislation that does reflect the reality on the ground, that would impose swift and crippling sanctions on Russia's economy if Putin decides to invade. It would provide critical additional military support to our Ukrainian allies, and it would strengthen support to our Eastern European allies in the face of Putin's attempt to look backward, not forward. We are not going to give Vladimir Putin and Russia the ability to veto who joins NATO. We saw that very clearly at the session yesterday with Russian and NATO officials. Russia didn't like it because they didn't get the answer they wanted, which was a veto over who should be able to join NATO. We are going to continue to take a strong stand with our allies in opposition to what Russia is doing. But we can't use yesterday's solutions to help us solve today's problems. The immediate threat that we are facing right now is the threat of Russian invasion of Ukraine, and we need to do everything possible, work as closely as possible, show no daylight with our allies in standing up to that threat. And unfortunately, what Senator Cruz is proposing with the Nord Stream 2 sanctions legislation would do exactly that. It would drive a wedge between us and our allies, particularly between the United States and Germany, at a time that we cannot afford. So I intend to vote against this legislation and support Senator Menendez's legislation that will give us the tools we need to continue to address potential Russian aggression. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor and look forward to hearing Senator Murphy's comments because I know he shares the same concerns that I'm expressing.
Madam President.
The senator from Connecticut.
Thank you very much, Madam President. First and foremost, let me thank Senator Shaheen. She has been a leader in the Senate, in our caucus, on raising alarms about the danger of Nord Stream 2 to European security and Ukrainian security. And I've been so glad to work with her over these past several years. And I'm here on the floor to join her in our strong opposition to the legislation that is pending on the floor as we speak. If this bill passes, it won't make the Nord Stream pipeline any less likely. It won't stop Russia from invading Ukraine. In fact, it will do the exact opposite. It will make the completion of Nord Stream more likely, and it will be a gift to Russia, dividing us from our European allies right at the moment when we need to be in solidarity with them in order to deter Russian aggression. I'll try not to repeat too much of what Senator Shaheen has said, but let me just underscore the points that she has made. First, the sanctions in this bill are unfortunately pretty feckless. They're feckless because they can be undone easily within 30 to 60 days by the Russian government. The reality is, if we don't convince our European partners to stop moving forward with this project, there's no amount of U.S. sanction that can be effective here. What we know is that even if you were to sanction this German-Swiss company, the German board of directors, in a matter of days, weeks, maybe a few months, the Russians could re-engineer the financing and the administration of the project to keep it going. Even more interesting to me is what Senator McConnell just said. Senator McConnell just came to the floor and said, well, he supports Senator Cruz's proposal. He expects that the Biden administration will waive the sanctions. So then why are we engaging in this in the first place? If Republicans are going to support the waiving of the sanctions because the sanctions would interrupt our negotiations with Germany, why pass the bill in the first place? So apparently, many Republicans are supporting the Cruz bill, but then are going to be asking the Biden administration to not implement it. That doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. The primary impact of this bill, as Senator Shaheen explained, is to divide us from Germany. Why is that? Because we know that the only way to stop Nord Stream 2 is by convincing the Germans and other Europeans to stop the project. Now, we have, for the first time since we began talking to the Germans about this, convinced them to press pause. First time, German government has decided to press pause through their regulatory agencies. They have stopped the certification of the pipeline, which, by the way, is built. It was 95% built when President Trump left office. He let it be constructed. 95% built. It is now 100% built. But the Germans have, because of American diplomacy and because of a threat of invasion of Ukraine from Russia, pressed pause on this project. It can't start until the summer or the fall. And frankly, that time allows us to continue to engage with the Germans and others to try to convince them that this project is not in their interest. So think about this from the German perspective. They finally said yes to the United States. And the minute that they say yes is the minute that the United States Senate decides to sanction German citizens. That's bad diplomacy. It's just bad diplomacy. And it's a moment at which we have to be in lockstep with our European partners. We need to be sending a message to Vladimir Putin that the United States and Europe are together and that we are going to deliver a crushing package of sanctions if you enter Ukraine any further. This would be a gift to Vladimir Putin because it's a signal of division at a moment when we need to be standing together. Senator Menendez has the right approach. Senator Menendez has proposed a bill which I think can draw support from 90% of this body that enacts a set of sanctions on Russia if Russia moves any further into Ukraine, beyond where they are already in eastern Ukraine and Crimea. That sends the right signal. That's an effective message of consequence, rather than this proposal, which apparently is a set of sanctions Republicans are going to ask to be waived and divides us from our partners at a moment when we need to be together. Lastly, I want to address one particular point that I've heard Senator Cruz make over and over and over again in defense of his proposal. Senator Cruz says that the construction of the pipeline stopped when Congress passed the Nord Stream sanctions and didn't begin again until Joe Biden became president. I've seen that repeated in the press, and it just isn't true. One company that was laying the pipeline backed out of the project when the 2019 sanctions bill was passed. But then guess what happened? Russia started retrofitting other ships to finish the job. And the minute that they were permitted, construction began again, not when Joe Biden was president, when Donald Trump was president. The ships were ready in May of 2020, before Joe Biden was even nominated, and they started work a few months later, as soon as the Danish government permitted them. Now, Senator Shaheen and Senator Cruz had passed a sanctions bill with all of our support at the end of 2019. And during all of 2020, while the Russians were retrofitting these ships, while they were sending them back to Danish waters, while the permitting process was happening, Donald Trump didn't enact one sanction that was permitted by Congress. Congress passed a law in the end of 2019. All of 2020, Donald Trump didn't enact a single sanction. This was the critical moment. This was the time in which the meat of the pipeline was being built. And President Trump did nothing. And he paid no consequence for it. You know why? Because in 2020, Senator Cruz didn't hold up any of Donald Trump's State Department nominees when Trump was refusing to implement sanctions, when the Russians sent ships that started showing up to restart construction. Not even when construction restarted in the fall of 2020. Nope, during this time, all of Trump's State Department nominees sailed through without a single Republican objection or blockade. On Trump's last day in office, his last day, literally as he was packing up the Oval Office, January 19th, he sanctioned one ship and the company that owned the ship. Essentially a signal of how little he cared. On the day that he was leaving, he sanctioned one ship and the company that owned the ship. But by this time, 95% of the pipeline was complete. It was too late. And then he begrudgingly hands over the keys to the Oval Office to Joe Biden and leaves the incoming president with a mess. A pipeline 95% built that Donald Trump could have stopped if he had used the sanctions that he was given. So you can understand why some of us wonder what the motivation is behind Senator Cruz's extraordinary tactics now, when the pipeline is already built. It seems that the difference between 2020 and 2021 is essentially that now there's a Democrat in the White House. This bill isn't going to help Ukraine. It's designed to hurt the President of the United States. And unfortunately, some, not all, but some of our Republican colleagues here have consistently put their desire to politically harm President Biden ahead of their desire to protect the nation. Holding up the confirmation of President Biden's nominees, it doesn't help the security of the nation. It just increases the chances that the United States won't have the personnel on hand to deal with a crisis somewhere around the world when it develops, and that failure may hurt Joe Biden's approval rating. Unfortunately, I think that's what's going on here. Unfortunately, I think that's what's going on here, and I hope that my colleagues see it. I yield the floor.
Senator from New Hampshire.
Would my colleague yield for a question?
I would.
Senator Murphy, I'm really pleased, sadly pleased, but I think it's really appropriate that you brought up the issue about holding State Department nominees, because one of the things that has been unfortunate about Senator Cruz's approach to Nord Stream 2 in recent weeks has not just been his holding up of nominees, but has been his suggestion that the change in response on my part and on others who oppose Nord Stream 2 has been partisan. But as you point out, during all of the Trump administration, Senator Cruz did not hold one nominee because of Nord Stream 2. Is that your understanding?
That's my understanding. My understanding is that there may have been private advocacy or public speeches given, but that there certainly wasn't the tactic used that has been used during 2020, which is extraordinary, the holding of all nominees. And I think I'd add to that that Democratic senators have not used that tactic, right? We had huge disagreements with President Trump's policy, including his failure to use sanctions that were given to him by Congress to stop the pipeline at the moment when those sanctions would have been most effective. But we didn't block all of President Trump's ambassadors and State Department personnel because we thought that it was better to have those people on hand working to protect U.S. interests than it was to have those positions vacant. And that's the case we've been trying to make on this floor, that if you really care about helping Ukraine, why did Senator Cruz spend all of 2020 blocking ambassadors and State Department personnel whose job it would have been to help Ukraine? And no one's been more engaged on this question in this fight than you have, Senator Shaheen.
Well, I think the other important point that we both made is the fact that what stopped Allseas and the pipeline when the first sanctions bill was passed was the threat of sanctions. It wasn't actually implementing those sanctions. And in fact, it was then Russia's ability to come back in, retrofit ships, and do the work themselves. Gazprom and Russian ships did the work themselves. And throughout the last year of the Trump administration, they refused to take any action to address that. In fact, I remember being in a meeting, I can't remember if you were in that meeting or not, with Senator Cruz and some of our Republican colleagues and a member of the administration urging us to pass another sanctions bill because the administration had not acted. So I think it's really important, as you say, to point out that 95% of that pipeline was done under the previous administration when Senator Cruz and our colleagues who would like to stop the pipeline had the opportunity to hold up his nominees to raise those concerns, and that did not happen. And that puts us at a disadvantage today as we look at the threat of Nord Stream. Would you agree with that?
I would, and if you don't mind, Senator Shaheen, I'll just go through the timeline once again because I think it's important. December of 2019, Congress passes the sanctions bill that you and Senator Cruz champion. That stops Allseas, the private company, from constructing the pipeline. They pull back, but immediately Russia starts retrofitting their own ships. And we knew it. We saw it. This wasn't secret. That happens for the beginning of 2020, and by May 2020, those ships are on their way. From May until October, they're caught up in permitting. But it's just a matter of time. Everybody knows that those ships are eventually going to start laying down pipe. And by October of 2020, before Joe Biden is elected president, those ships are back doing construction. October, November, December, all throughout the end of 2020, those ships are back rebuilding the pipeline such that on January 19th, the last day of Trump's presidency, 95% of the pipeline, somewhere around 95% of the pipeline is done. And then literally walking out the door, Donald Trump lays down a sanction on one company and one ship that the company owns. And all through 2020, no blockade of State Department nominees, no grinding to the halt of Senate nominations business to try to prompt the president to change his mind. All of that magically starts happening when Joe Biden is president, when 95% of the pipeline is done. I hope, Senator Shaheen, and I'll let you wrap up, I hope that we can find a way to get on the same page here, because we have been for much of the last several years, and you've led that effort. I think Senator Menendez's legislation, which is all about the sort of right set of incentives and disincentives for Russia, for Russian behavior, is perhaps the means that we can sort of elevate this above the question of who's president and get back to fighting for the interests of our nation and the interests of our partners in Ukraine.
Well, thank you, Senator Murphy. I couldn't say it any better. Yield the floor.